Thanks for watching us here at Tax Talk UK, where we talk about all things tax and try to help you to understand how this applies to you as an individual. Today, I'm going to talk about tax codes, how they work, and how to know how to check your tax code. Before I do, if I could please ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll easily be able to refer back to this information if you need to, as well as being able to find other information that we have on a whole host of different topics, all aimed at supporting you in your self-employment. If you navigate to the playlist section of our channel, you'll find the information all catalogued loosely into playlists to try to help you to find the information that's going to be most relevant to you. So back then to tax codes. What is a tax code? How does it work? How do you know if your tax code is correct? So in the UK, for income tax, we have two methods that HMRC use in order for people to know and to pay the liability that they're due. So the one that we're talking about today is tax codes. This is the PAYE system, whereby employers, pension providers, and so forth collect the tax that's due on the income at source. This is known at. They pay it directly to HMRC and pay you the amount that's left. And of course, there may be other deductions such as national insurance, pension, etc. And then the other system is self-assessment. So with self-assessment, you complete and submit a self-assessment tax return stating all of your income for the tax year. And this then determines the information provided is used to calculate and determine your liability to income tax. And then it's paid directly to HMRC. And there is some interaction between the two systems, but they are to all accounts they are separate systems. But there are circumstances where, for example, liability may be transferred from one to another. So, for example, somebody with income through PAYE that's affected by a tax code may have a liability on their self-assessment tax return, and they may transfer that to a tax code. And similarly, even if the income has all been taxed at source, then using a tax code, and you are completing a self-assessment for whatever reason, if you're required to complete one, then you will still be putting on there the income that you've earned through the PAYE scheme. And this is because in the UK tax is cumulative. So that means that in terms of income tax liability, the whole tax year's income is added together and used to determine the liability, and that's from all different sources as well. So the more complex your tax affairs are, the more room for error there is in the tax code system. So a tax code is basically where the HMRC use this to give the tax code to your employer or pension provider, and this helps them to determine how much tax they should be deducting, what sort of bands and thresholds and rates to apply for that income. Now, one thing to talk about before we actually get on to the mechanics and the specifics of the tax code is to say that much as payroll and PAYE has had some progress moving forward and being more digital and being more timely, it still is quite a manual process in lots of respects. So when HMRC issue a tax code notice to your employer, you will get a copy with the full breakdown, which shows you exactly how they've calculated that code. Your employer doesn't get that detail, they just get the code that they need to apply. Some employers may have software that links to their gateway and is able to digitally upload any changes to tax code. But some employers, especially smaller ones, but still some larger ones, are reliant on receiving a notification from HMRC, downloading the tax code, and then uploading that into the payroll system. Different employers will have different cut-off times. So it may be that a code's issued, but for one reason or another, there's a delay in it being applied. So this is why it's really important that you understand what your tax code is, what it's trying to achieve, and then that means that you would be aware of any such nuances that may cause problems in it collecting the right tax. Because the important thing to understand is that your tax code is a way of HMRC helping to try to collect the correct tax at source. But if there is any underpayment in tax collected, that is your responsibility. So if at the end of the year, either because the wrong tax code was issued, or it wasn't applied by your employer, or it was applied incorrectly, it doesn't matter what the reason, it is still your responsibility to pay any underpaid tax. I mean, on the other side of that, if there is any overpaid tax, then you would be refunded that. That would obviously be a pleasant surprise, but getting a tax bill at the end of the year when you've not expected it and potentially, sort of spent the money that you've had is not so great. So how the tax code works then, let's start with a really sort of basic scenario, just to help you to understand how it's going to work. So ordinarily, somebody who's a UK resident for tax purposes would have a personal allowance. So currently that is £12,570. And that means that that person can earn that much income that will be, there's no tax due. If you think of it as 0% tax, that can help keep things less confusing as the information becomes more complex. So what HMRC want to tell your employer is that don't, on the first £12,570 of this person's income, don't deduct any tax, deduct 0% tax. And above that, up to the high rate band, deduct 20% tax. So this is what your employer will do. So how that will operate is your employer invariably these days will use software to calculate the payroll. And how that's going to work is if your income, if you're in the standard rate band, then your employer is going to know that the first 12,570 is 0 tax, and then above that is 20% tax. So how the software will apply that is HMRC will issue a tax code, and the standard tax code would be 1257L. And what that is telling your employer is allow a personal allowance of 12,570, deduct 0%, no tax on that amount, and then anything above that, deduct 20%. And obviously then if you go into the high rate, that your employer would know that too. So how that would apply in practical terms is the software would divide the 12,570 or whatever the current personal allowance was by 12, and each, assuming that was a monthly pay, or 52 for weekly pay, and for each pay period, they would apply the fraction of that allowance. So if you were paid monthly, they would apply 1/12. So just over £1,000 they wouldn't deduct tax from, and anything above they would deduct at 20% unless you went into high rate tax, and then that would obviously be at that equivalent rate. So that is nice and straightforward. It would be unlikely that there would be any issues with that, because it's straightforward. When the complications come in is when more things come into play, or when you have different sources of income. So in that basic scenario where you just have a standard personal allowance, your employer would just get the code 1257L to apply, and you would get a tax code notice which shows you how that's calculated. So that would be very basic. This is your personal allowance, no adjustments, therefore that is your code. So then other things start to get factored in. So for example, if you are into high rate tax, it may be that you make personal pension contributions, not through your employer, not deducted from your salary, but from your own money, pay into a pension. This increases the threshold that you go into high rate tax. The same if you gift aid to charity. So these things need to be notified to your employer, because otherwise they're not going to make any allowances for that, and you wouldn't be given those increases in the bands, and then therefore you'd be overpaying tax. So in the tax code, then they would start with the 12,570 allowance, and then it would add the adjustments to for the things like your pension or your gift aid, which they're all covered in more detail in other videos if you want more information on those, but those sorts of things would be included. So therefore, if you get a copy of a tax code notice, for example, and it has job expenses or pension contributions or gift aid, the important thing for you to understand is that correct? Is that the correct amount? Because then the tax code should do its work and actually work in to calculate the right tax. But if you don't understand how the tax code is going to calculate your tax, what is important is that you understand that where those figures have come from and that they are correct. So for example, with gift aid, for example, it may be that fluctuates year in, year out, and you will need to notify HMRC, because if, for example, one year you paid donated higher than usual via gift aid, then it's going to get carried forward until such time that you notify HMRC, and that could ultimately lead to you underpaying tax if they're giving you more increase in your band than you're actually entitled to. So this is what I always say if you are not sure where to go to start calculating or to start checking your tax code and to understand how much tax you'll pay, is if you don't do anything else with your tax code, just make sure that you know the adjustments and you know that those figures are correct for the tax year. And if they're wrong, make sure you notify HMRC. So then other adjustments might come, because you might have two sources of income, maybe two separate PAYE employers, maybe a pension being received and employment. But for whatever reason, it may be that that your tax code isn't going to collect without any adjustment, because your employer is only going to know what they're paying you. So imagine a scenario where you have two separate employments, and they both pay you £10,000 each. Well, those £10,000 in isolation, each employer is going to think they're paying you below the personal allowance. And so if they both use the standard tax code, then you're going to be given £20,000 personal allowance in that scenario, whereas you should only have received 12,570. So therefore you're going to have received too much at 0%, which should have been at 20%, and therefore you're going to underpay tax. And your employers won't know about necessarily each other. Obviously, you may tell them, your contract may require that, but in any case, through the official HMRC route, obviously they won't be allowed to disclose. So therefore, using the information that HMRC are receiving to know what's happening, they will apply so much of your tax code to one, so much to another, or maybe all to one and all to and none to the other, depending on how much you're earning. HMRC will try and do it in the most efficient way. That's that's possible. So that might be something that needs another adjustment, because you may have one employment source may have a different tax code to the other. So you should get one notice that explains your total any adjustments, and then it will explain what code's been given to which employer or which source of PAY income, so you can check that that is going to collect the right amount of tax. So, for example, if your personal allowance has been given to one employer, but you only earn £5,000 a year from them, then clearly there's going to be unused personal allowance. So then you would contact HMRC and ask them to split the tax code. So there's lots of things that would the tax code would be used to adjust. If you earn over 100,000 and you start to lose your personal allowance, that also would be adjusted for your tax code by reducing the personal allowance. This can get quite complicated in the instance where you have like a stable income, the same amount of income every month. That's still fairly straightforward. But again, the adjustments can cause complications. But then in a scenario where, for example, if you receive an annual bonus, if you go back to the first scenario that I was talking about, of how the payroll is going to split your allowance for each month, it's also going to assume that whatever your income to date is going to be replicated and become your annual income. So depending on where you have a peak in your income can also impact the tax that's deducted. For example, if you have it early on in the tax year, it may mean that the software is going to be presuming you're going to be going into a higher tax band, which would obviously sort of filter out through the year as it realised that that wasn't the case. And the same at the other end, if actually you are in a higher band because of a peak in payment, because of a bonus or lump sum payment from your employment, then it may be that there's no time for the tax code to be adjusted for the end of the tax year. So there's lots of things that will adjust the tax code. One final one that causes confusion is when you have an underpayment of tax and HMRC use your tax code to collect it. So let's say, for example, that you underpaid your tax in 1 year by £200 and HMRC looked to use your tax code to collect that. So everything else on your tax code adjustments, you're going to see the actual amounts that for the adjustments. So things like job expenses, gift aid, pensions, those sorts of things, you're going to see the amount of those things on the notice. But how you need to think of it, if you've got an underpaid tax, if they adjusted your tax code by £200 in that scenario, you can see that it's going to reduce your relief by £200. So that's only going to collect £40 tax at 20% rate. So what they would need to do is to gross that up to say, well, we want to collect £200 extra tax, so therefore we need to adjust the code by £1,000, because reducing the allowance by £1,000 is going to collect £200 more tax at 20%. And if you're in a higher bracket, a higher tax band, then obviously then it would be grossed up differently. But that does cause a lot of confusion, and we have had a lot of questions on that. So just to explain, that is why you don't see the amount of the underpayment, you see the grossed up amount. And also, if you are completing a self-assessment, it is really important that if you have an underpayment being collected, that that amount is entered on the tax return for the year that it's being collected, because otherwise the self-assessment won't realise that there was that extra to be collected, and it will say, oh, you've overpaid tax of £200, because you've got to tell the in the return, you've got to self-assess the amount that was being collected, so that it can be something that causes a lot of confusion. Tax codes generally do cause a lot of confusion, but as I mentioned, bear in mind the how the system works. Bear in mind that if the tax code doesn't collect the right tax, it's your responsibility to pay any shortfalls. And if the least you can do is to look at your tax code notice and understand the adjustments that are on there and that they are the correct amounts that are individual for you, and to notify HMRC, then you have your best chance of your tax code being able to collect the correct tax. So as I say, it does get progressively more complex as more things are trying to be adjusted through the tax code. So it's easy to see how things can go wrong, which effectively would result in not the correct amount of tax being deducted, which would be your responsibility. If your tax affairs are complex, even if your income is all through the PAYE system, even if you're not required to, you can complete a self-assessment tax return, which would assure you that that the correct tax has been collected, or you can contact HMRC at the end of the tax year to ask them to review that. At some point they would review it, but they do have up to 4 years to do that. So if it's not picked up straight away, an underpayment, and you're partway into the next year, it can, you know, if you've not paid enough tax, you want to know straight away. So the more complex your tax code is, the more things that are trying to be adjusted and collected or allowed through your tax code, the more room there is for error, the more important it is that you understand. And of course, if you don't understand, and you know, it can be prudent to take some advice, engage somebody to help you with that. Of course, if you do that, like I always say, and make sure they are qualified for the advice they're giving you, make sure they're a member of a professional body if applicable, and that they hold indemnity insurance. So hopefully this helps you to understand how your tax code works. And even if you don't feel that you completely understand your tax code, hopefully that gives you enough information to know to at least look at the figures that are you know being used to adjust, and make sure they're the right figures as applicable to you. Notify HMRC if not. Just one final thing to mention on tax codes is what we call the week one, month one basis. So ordinarily your tax code will apply for the whole year. So if something changes in your tax code, it will apply retrospectively to the start of the tax year, to make sure that up to date your tax for the year is correct. Sometimes for one reason or another, it's not possible for that to be done. And so therefore HMRC will try to adjust in the tax code for any discrepancies year to date. And they will ask for it to be calculated on a month one, week one basis. And what that means is each period is going to be calculated in isolation. Now, again, the more complex your tax affairs are, the more open to error that can create. But that is what that means, and it means that you don't, it's any calculations don't look at the whole. And when I say they're looking at the whole year, it's only for that source of employment, because as I said earlier, your employer will only know what they've paid you. If you've got another source of income, then that won't be reflected. There's no mechanism other than they're both reporting to HMRC and HMRC flagging that up and using your tax code. There's no other mechanism for the PAYE income to be linked up. As I say, if it is complex and you are concerned, you can submit a self-assessment tax return voluntarily. So thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Goodbye.